The wax seal cracked beneath the solicitor's thumb, and the dry little sound carried through the boardroom like a warning. On the table lay the founder's forbidding deed, its vellum yellowed, its black script still sharp enough to wound, and when Mr. Fenwick cleared his throat to read, even the nursery bell in the passage beyond seemed to fall silent. Cordelia Hart stood at the long end of the table, with her gloved hands resting on the carved back of a chair she had not taken. She was 27, mistress of Hart House by law and by habit, and she had long ago learned that sitting too quickly in a room full of men invited them to think the meeting belonged to them. Her dark dress was plain, her posture exact, her expression composed enough to be mistaken for coldness by anyone who did not know her well. Mrs. Vale, the matron of Penfold Foundling Hospital, knew better. She saw the quick pulse at the base of Cordelia's throat when the reading began. "No Hart," said Mr. Fenwick, "nor any descendant of the house of Marchmont shall sit in common governance over this institution. Should such joint authority be presumed or enacted, the endowment attached to this charity shall be forfeit." The words settled over the room like dust from an opened crypt. A junior trustee shifted in his seat. Another coughed into his hand. Somewhere upstairs, in the foundling ward, a child laughed. One bright, careless burst of sound, gone at once. Cordelia kept her eyes on the parchment. "And yet," she said after a moment, her voice level, "the hospital has always depended upon both houses." Mrs. Vale folded her work-worn fingers together. "It has depended upon their money, Miss Hart, not upon their peace." That was the ugly joke of it. For 3 generations the Harts and the Dukes of Marchmont had despised one another with perfect courtesy and dependable punctuality. They endowed the same chapel roof, repaired the same infirmary windows, paid the same wet nurses, and would not stand side by side to inspect the same accounts. Pride, when fed regularly, grows fat and respectable. Mr. Fenwick removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "There is more. The Crown Charter falls due this season. The commissioners have made it plain. Unless the houses appear publicly reconciled and capable of stable patronage, the endowment reverts to the Treasury." That, at last, made Cordelia turn from the deed to the faces in the room. "Reverts?" she repeated. "Yes." The words seemed to drain the heat from the air. She smelled candle wax, old paper, clean linen from the ward, and beneath it all that faint medicinal scent every hospital keeps, no matter how often the windows are opened. Reversion meant clerks, delays, petitions, and children waiting while gentlemen argued over forms. It meant hunger made respectable by procedure. Mrs. Vale spoke quietly. "If the money is seized back, I close 2 rooms before winter." 2 rooms. 2 rows of narrow beds. 2 sets of small hands reaching for broth that would not be there. Cordelia drew off one glove, finger by finger. "Has Marchmont been told?" Mr. Fenwick hesitated. That was answer enough. Then, from the corridor outside, hurried steps approached the door, and the footman entered carrying a sealed note on a salver. "It has come now, miss," he said, "from His Grace, the Duke of Marchmont. He requests a private interview this afternoon." If you'd like to stay with this story, subscribe and come with me into the next part. By the time the Duke's carriage rolled under the bare lime trees at Hart House, the light had gone thin and silver. Cordelia received him in the long gallery, where the air always smelled faintly of beeswax and old velvet, and where her ancestors looked down from blackened frames as if they meant to witness every insult in person. Rowan, Duke of Marchmont, entered without haste and without apology. He was taller than she had expected, dark-haired, grave, and dressed with that severe simplicity which on some men suggests economy and on others authority. On him it suggested both. He bowed exactly as courtesy required. She curtsied no deeper than rank demanded. Between them stood a small table, 2 untouched cups of tea, and 3 generations of polished resentment. "Miss Hart?" "Your Grace?" He did not sit until she had done so, and even then he remained very straight in the chair, one gloved hand resting on his knee. "I will spare you the usual expressions of regret," he said. "We have little time, and the hospital has less." It was not gracious, but it was honest, and that startled her more than charm would have done. "You have read the conditions," she said. "I have read them, argued with them, and exhausted the patience of 2 barristers over them." His gaze moved once toward the window, where the last of the afternoon clung to the glass. "If the commissioners believe our houses remain hostile, the charter fails." Cordelia folded her hands. "Then let them be persuaded by the truth. We both support the place. We both mean it to continue." "The truth," he said quietly, "is that our families have behaved like rival kingdoms over a nursery." She almost smiled at the harshness of it, though she would sooner have admitted to a fever. "That is an unflattering description." "It is still correct." The pause that followed was not comfortable, but neither was it empty. She studied him more carefully. He looked tired, not idle man tired, nor bored man tired. There was a worn steadiness about him, the look of someone who had spent too many mornings with papers and too many evenings hearing why duty ought to be simpler than it was. At last, he said, "There is no petition we can raise quickly enough to undo the founder's language. No cousin can stand in for me without inviting a challenge. No trustee can stand in for you without offending half the county. There is only one course that may satisfy appearances." She knew, a second before he spoke, that she was going to hate him for naming it. "A public understanding," he said. "An engagement." The word seemed to strike the paneling and return. Cordelia set down her cup very carefully. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." "You propose to offer marriage as one might offer scaffolding?" "I propose," he said, and now a trace of impatience entered that even voice, "to keep 2 wards of children from being turned into a treasury convenience." The blood rose hot under her skin. "And in your plan, I am to stand beside you smiling while the county congratulates itself on a romance it has not earned?" "In my plan," Rowan said, "you are to do what you have already been doing, protect the hospital, only more publicly." She rose. So did he at once. "You think me vain." "I think you proud," he answered. "The distinction matters." Before she could reply, the gallery door opened, and Mrs. Selwyn stepped in with visible reluctance. "Forgive me," she said, looking from one to the other. "A gentleman has arrived from Penfold. He says the matter admits of no delay." "The gentleman's name?" Cordelia asked. Mrs. Selwyn hesitated. "Hector Mallow, miss, and he claims he has come to save the hospital." Mrs. Selwyn's announcement left the gallery colder than before. For one brief second, Cordelia had the absurd feeling that the walls themselves were listening, that the old portraits along the paneling had leaned a fraction nearer to hear what answer she would make. "Show him to the morning room," she said. Rowan turned his head toward her. "If Mallow has come on hospital business, I should remain." She looked at him then, directly. "This is my house, Your Grace, and Penfold concerns us both." The words were plain, but they altered something. A half-hour earlier she would have called his presence an intrusion. Now, with Hector Mallow waiting downstairs and the hospital hanging over every decision like a bell about to strike, she found she did not wish to face that visitor alone. "Very well," she said. "You may stay." The morning room overlooked the west lawn, where the last light had gone out behind a row of yews. The fire was low, the lamps newly lit, and the silver on the tea tray gave off a dim red gleam. Hector Mallow rose as they entered. He was handsome in the easy, finished way some men are handsome by habit, as if they had spent years arranging their faces into expressions women were expected to trust. His coat was cut too well for modesty, his voice too soft for sincerity. "Miss Hart," he said with a bow. Then he saw Rowan beside her, and only the smallest pause betrayed him. "Your Grace, what an unexpected comfort! It seems concern for the hospital unites us all." "Does it?" Rowan asked. Mallow smiled as though the question amused him. "I should hope so. We are speaking of helpless children, after all." Cordelia invited no one to sit, and so for a few moments the three of them remained standing in a triangle of lamplight and shadow. She could smell damp wool from Mallow's cloak and the faint, sweet note of bergamot from his gloves. He carried the weather in with him, though there had been no rain. "I am told," he said, "that the Crown may reclaim the endowment if the present difficulties are not resolved. I have therefore taken the liberty of preparing a proposal." He produced a folded paper from his coat and laid it upon the tea table as if it were an offering. Cordelia did not touch it. "What sort of proposal?" she asked. "A humane one. Temporary consolidation. The older children placed out with respectable families, the youngest transferred in stages. The building itself leased, perhaps, until the legal uncertainties are settled. Waste must be prevented. Mrs. Vale's 2 wards, the narrow beds, the nursery bell. Cordelia heard all of it in the word leased. "And who," Rowan said, "would oversee this humane reordering?" Mallow turned his palms very slightly upward. "If no reconciliation can be achieved between the proper patrons, then someone impartial must surely be found, someone practical, someone not fettered by inherited temper." It was cleverly done. He had not said himself, he had not needed to. Cordelia lifted the paper at last. It smelled sharply of fresh ink. At the bottom, beneath a page of tidy phrases about stewardship and efficiency, stood Hector Mallow's name, already signed with a flourish broad enough to suggest possession. "You came quickly," she said. "I have always taken a strong interest in the institution." "Have you?" Rowan's tone remained mild. "How fortunate for you." Mallow's eyes flickered once between them. He was measuring something now. Resistance, perhaps, or opportunity. Cordelia set the paper down. She felt suddenly very clear, as if all the useless fog of offense had burned away and left only hard ground beneath her feet. Pride could wait. The children could not. She turned to Rowan. "If an understanding were announced," she said, each word exact, "would you stand to it without embellishment, without advantage, and for no longer than necessity requires?" His answer came at once. "I would." Mallow's face did not change. Only his fingers tightened against the back of his chair. Cordelia drew one breath. "Then, Mr. Mallow," she said, and the room went still around her, "you may offer your congratulations." For one suspended moment, no one moved. The coal in the grate gave a soft crack, a log shifted inward, and Hector Mallow's careful expression hardened so slightly that only a watchful eye would have caught it. Then he bowed. "My congratulations," he said. "What happy news, and so timely." Cordelia heard the edge beneath the smoothness. Rowan heard it too. He stepped no nearer to her, yet his presence altered the room all the same, as if some line had been drawn that Mallow could not cross without naming his own intentions aloud. "You are very good," Cordelia replied. Mallow's gaze settled on her face with false warmth. "I trust your happiness will prove as durable as your benevolence, Miss Hart." "It must," said Rowan, "for the hospital's sake." That checked him. Only for a beat, but it was enough. He took his leave soon after, with phrases of politeness so exact they sounded like polished metal. When the outer door had closed behind him and the carriage wheels faded down the drive, Cordelia remained standing in the morning room, one hand resting on the marble mantel, feeling the heat of the stone through her glove. "You forced my hand," she said without turning. "Yes." The plain answer made her look back at him. He stood where Mallow had left him, tall and composed, though there was a weariness in his eyes now that the performance had begun. "Had we waited," Rowan said, "he would have carried his version of events to every trustee within a day. Better ours be the first story told." "You speak of a betrothal as if it were a parliamentary notice." "I speak of survival," he answered. Then, after a pause, "You may still withdraw. I will not bind you by surprise." She stared at him. The fire gave off the smell of oak smoke and hot iron. Somewhere in the passage a maid hurried by with folded linen, unaware that the life of a charity had just been staked upon a lie. Cordelia thought of 2 closed wards, of children sent away in carts under some scheme Mallow would call efficient. Her pride flared once more, and then yielded to something sterner. "No," she said. "If we do this, we do it properly." That was the first true agreement between them. By morning, the tale had outrun both houses. A footman at Hart House had a cousin in Marchmont kitchens. A groom had a sister at the hospital laundry. Before noon, Mrs. Vale had received 3 notes of inquiry, 1 basket of flowers, and a visit from a rector's wife who claimed she had always hoped for reconciliation. Cordelia arrived at Penfold through air so cold it stung the lungs, and found Rowan already there in the committee room, his gloves laid beside a stack of account books. Mrs. Vale closed the door on them all and said, "If this is to save the children, I will bless it. If it is to amuse the county, I will not." "It is to save the children," Cordelia said. "And to satisfy the commissioners," Rowan added. The matron studied them, then nodded once. "Very well. Then you will need every paper in order." She crossed to an old cabinet by the window, drew out a shallow drawer, and laid a narrow folded sheet upon the table. The parchment was brittle, tied with a faded blue thread. Dust rose from it when she touched it. "I found this last night among the founder's later instructions," she said. "It was pinned behind a register cover and overlooked for years. I thought at first it was nothing. I do not think so now." Rowan unfolded it carefully. Cordelia leaned nearer. The note was brief, written in the same old hand as the original hospital rules. And in the final lines, under a dark flourish of ink, the founder had added a warning neither house had ever mentioned. Should any appearance of harmony be contrived for gain and discovered so before the commissioners, the endowment shall be judged doubly forfeit, as deceit added to division. The note lay between them for several seconds while the fire settled in the grate, and Mrs. Vale said nothing at all. Cordelia could hear the ticking of the small brass clock on the mantel, the scratch of a branch against the hospital window, and somewhere beyond the committee room door, the distant murmur of children being led to supper. Rowan set the paper down with great care. "If this clause is acknowledged before the commissioners," he said, "and if anyone proves our understanding was arranged merely to preserve the endowment—" Mrs. Vale finished the thought. "Then Penfold loses everything." Cordelia drew off her gloves and placed them beside the note. Her fingers felt cold, though the room was warm. "How has this never been seen?" "It was hidden badly," said Mrs. Vale, "and preserved by neglect, like many dangerous things." That was the shape of the whole affair, was it not? A deed, a feud, a room full of decent people trying not to look too closely at old malice, because old malice had become familiar. Cordelia bent nearer the paper again. The handwriting was firm, impatient, final, No court in the land would call it anything but genuine. Rowan's mind moved where hers did, swift and exact. Then appearances alone will not serve. If we are watched, we must look less arranged than we are. She glanced up at him. You make deceit sound like a branch of estate management. I make it sound difficult, he replied. That, annoyingly, was true. Mrs. Vale gathered the account books toward her and began dividing them into neat stacks. Difficult or not, the hospital still needs coal, milk, candles, wages, and linen before it needs romance. If the two of you are to save this place, you may begin with matters less poetic. So they did. For the next hour, the committee room became something far plainer than a stage. Rowan reviewed the arrears on 3 charity cottages that should have been yielding rent but had not. Cordelia checked the invoices for flour and soap and found that the baker's account had been copied twice in different hands. Mrs. Vale produced a list of roof slates that must be replaced before the damp spread into the nursery ceiling. It was practical work, dry on the surface, yet it bound them faster than flirtation could have done. They did not agree on every point. Rowan favored immediate repair to the rear yard wall. Cordelia argued for blankets first. He listened. She listened. Between one ledger and the next, they discovered the useful fact that each of them knew how money vanished when sentiment was allowed to direct it carelessly. At length, Mrs. Vale rose to see to the evening round. You may continue here, she said, and if either of you intends to fall in love for the public good, pray do it after the wages are entered correctly. When she had gone, a quieter air settled over the room. Rowan turned another page. You were right about Mallow. Cordelia looked up from the slate in her lap. I have been right before. I do not doubt it. It was so dryly said that, despite herself, she let out the smallest breath of laughter. The sound surprised them both. His eyes lifted to hers, and for one brief instant, the false betrothal seemed less false because it had created this strange ease over unpaid chimney work and missing slate. Then a footman knocked and entered with a candle for the table. There is a message from Marchmont Lodge, Your Grace, he said. Lady Agnes asks whether Miss Hart is to be expected at dinner tomorrow evening. Cordelia stilled. Rowan took the folded card, read it, and met her gaze across the account books. It begins, he said, if the county is to believe us, you must come. She ought to have refused at once. That would have been simpler, safer, and far more in keeping with the rules by which Cordelia Hart had conducted her life. Yet she did not refuse. She only looked at Rowan across the hospital accounts, at the candlelight catching the hard line of his profile, and knew that simplicity had already gone. I will come, she said. The words seemed to settle among the ledgers like another binding document. By the following evening, Marchmont Lodge stood waiting under a sky the color of old pewter. Its long front of gray stone was severe rather than beautiful, with narrow windows lit gold against the early dark. Cordelia arrived with Mrs. Selwyn beside her in the carriage, both as escort and witness, and if Mrs. Selwyn found the whole business astonishing, she had too much breeding to say so before the front doors opened. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, lamp oil, and that faint, clean scent great halls acquire from polished floors and winter air. Lady Agnes received them in the saloon. She was a spare woman with white hair, bright eyes, and the composed expression of one who had spent years observing other people's disasters without ever becoming one herself. She kissed Cordelia's cheek lightly. My dear Miss Hart, she said, as though the visit were the most natural thing in the world, you are very welcome. We have all been waiting to see whether rumor had outrun truth. Cordelia removed her gloves finger by finger. On this occasion, I regret to say truth is running very hard. Lady Agnes's eyes flickered with amusement. Good. A slow truth is useless in county society. Rowan entered a moment later. He had changed for dinner, and the severity of black evening clothes made him look even more reserved than before. Yet when his gaze found Cordelia, there was a pause, brief but real. He came forward, bowed, and offered his arm for the walk into dinner. She placed her hand upon his sleeve, conscious at once of the fine cloth beneath her fingers and the quiet force in the man beneath it. The dining room was not large, but everything in it suggested inheritance well guarded. Family silver, portraits dim with age, a sideboard bearing old crystal that caught the candle flames and fractured them into trembling points of light. 2 elderly cousins of uncertain use had been invited to make the evening respectable, and a rector's widow completed the table. The conversation at first moved exactly where such conversation must: weather, roads, the lateness of frost, the condition of parish blankets. Yet beneath it ran another current. Everyone was watching. Cordelia felt it in every lifted glass and carefully neutral smile. Rowan, to his credit, did not overplay his part. He did not lean too near, did not shower her with attention, did not attempt some vulgar display of devotion for the benefit of witnesses. He simply made space for her. He drew Mrs. Selwyn into talk when she looked wary, asked after Hart tenants with knowledge rather than politeness, and when the rector's widow spoke of infants needing broth at the hospital, he turned to Cordelia with a quiet, "Miss Hart has stronger views than I do on that matter, and she is usually right." Usually. The word should have irritated her. Instead, absurdly, it steadied her. After dinner, Lady Agnes proposed tea in a smaller drawing room. The cousins drifted to the fire. Mrs. Selwyn took up a seat near the lamp with the air of a woman prepared to chaperone until dawn if required. Rowan brought Cordelia a cup, and as he did so, his hand brushed hers for the briefest instant. Neither spoke of it. Neither could pretend not to have felt it. Then Lady Agnes said with deceptive mildness, "Rowan, if Miss Hart is to be mistress here one day, surely she ought to see the older papers concerning the hospital. They are in the muniment room, are they not?" The cup in Cordelia's hand went still. Rowan looked at Lady Agnes, then at Cordelia. "Yes," he said at last, "and there may be something there you should see." Lady Agnes's remark altered the room more quickly than a raised voice would have done. Even Mrs. Selwyn, who had been prepared to disapprove of nearly everything connected with this visit, looked up with sudden attention. Cordelia set down her teacup. "Hospital papers?" Rowan did not answer at once. He stood with one hand on the mantel, the firelight catching the edge of his cuff, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed less guarded than deliberate, as though he were deciding not what to say, but how much truth could be trusted at once. "There are old board minutes," he said at last, "receipts, land schedules, letters from stewards and chaplains. My grandfather locked them away after my father's death and preferred not to speak of them again." Lady Agnes gave a small sound that might have meant agreement. "Your grandfather preferred silence in all matters that pricked his conscience." Mrs. Selwyn's brows rose, but she was too prudent to inquire further. Cordelia felt the faintest quickening in her chest. Paper had governed this quarrel from the beginning. Deeds, claims, accusations, denials, always documents, always signatures, and always someone long dead deciding how the living must behave. "If the records concern Penfold," she said, "I should like to see them." Rowan inclined his head. "Then you shall." The muniment room lay at the far end of an older corridor beyond the family chapel, a part of the house less warmed than preserved. A servant went ahead with a lamp. The passage smelled of cold stone, dried rush matting, and old polish. Their footfalls sounded different there, duller, as though thick walls had swallowed centuries of household noise and would give none of it back. Mrs. Selwyn, after one glance down that long, dim stretch, declared that she would wait in the saloon with Lady Agnes rather than risk a draught in her joints. Lady Agnes, who plainly knew very well what she was doing, accepted this without protest. So Cordelia found herself following Rowan alone. He unlocked 2 doors before they reached the room itself. The second key turned stiffly. When the door opened, the air inside was dry and faintly bitter with leather, dust, and old ink. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, tin boxes, deed rolls, tagged bundles of correspondence, estate maps in broad drawers. Everything stood in grave order. It was a place built for memory and mistrust. "You keep it well," she said quietly. "I keep it closed," he replied. He set the lamp on a table in the center of the room. Light spread across green bays, brass weights, and several ledgers already laid out as though he had anticipated this visit long before Lady Agnes forced the matter. Cordelia noticed that at once and said nothing. They began with hospital account books from the first generation of the feud. The entries were clear enough at a glance: rents received, grain purchased, wet nurses paid, repairs ordered to the infirmary roof. Yet the more she looked, the more some small inward resistance took hold. A date repeated itself oddly. A clerk's abbreviation changed shape in one quarter and then changed back. One year's summary referred to an audit note that was not attached. "Here," she said, touching a margin with one gloved finger. "This line mentions deficiency carried forward, but there is no original deficiency listed on the prior page." Rowan bent beside her to see. His shoulder came nearer than was proper, though neither moved away. "You have a sharp eye." "I have had to develop one." He looked at her then, not merely at the page. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the word that made her very conscious of the silence around them. She turned another sheet. Beneath a tied bundle of quarterly vouchers lay a narrower account book, worn at the corners and sealed with a strip of cracked black wax. On its cover, in a cramped hand, were 2 letters. E. C. Rowan's expression changed. "Ezekiel Crouch," he said, "our old steward." The little book seemed to darken the lamplight around it. Cordelia did not touch it at once. The cracked black wax had sunk into the leather over the years, and the initials on the cover looked less written than pressed there by habit and secrecy. "Was he in your grandfather's service?" she asked. "In my great-grandfather's first," Rowan said. "Then my grandfather retained him for a time. Crouch handled estate rents, charity disbursements, tenant settlements, whatever involved figures and silence." The last word stayed with her. Figures and silence. Those 2 things had governed too much already. Rowan broke the old seal with more care than force. The dry snap of it sounded very loud in the room. Inside were pages of close entries, neat columns, dates, names, sums, and terse remarks in a hand so controlled it almost seemed bloodless. Cordelia moved to the other side of the table beside him. Their sleeves nearly touched as he turned the first leaves. A list of barley purchases, nurse wages, lime for the infirmary wall, chapel candles. Then a page half scored through, rewritten in darker ink. She leaned closer. "There, that line was altered after the fact." "You are certain?" "The first stroke dips lower. Whoever returned to it used a finer nib." He looked from the page to her face, and for a heartbeat the room held more than parchment and dust. Respect, when it first appears between 2 stubborn people, is often sharper than tenderness. It startles them both. Together they worked on in the hush of the muniment room. He brought forward the earlier account books. She matched Crouch's entries against them. More than once the numbers disagreed in small but telling ways. Hospital oats paid twice in the private ledger, but shown unpaid in the board abstract. A nurse's quarter wage noted as delivered here, missing there. A cart repair assigned to the Foundling ward in one record and to Marchmont stables in another. Each inconsistency was slight on its own. Taken together, they began to form a pattern that made the back of Cordelia's neck prickle. "He was moving sums across boundaries," she said softly. "Not enough at once to invite alarm, only enough to make shortage seem plausible." "And if shortage seemed plausible," Rowan replied, "blame could be directed where it served him best." He drew out a tied packet of board memoranda and scanned one, then another. His expression grew colder with each page. At length, he found a single sheet, folded twice, bearing an old complaint from a Hart steward about missing grain allotments and delayed payments to the hospital nurses. The complaint had been answered in a different hand, with the accusation that Hart management itself had caused the deficiency. Cordelia took the paper from him. "This is the beginning of it." "Or the beginning of what we were told." That distinction mattered more than either of them said aloud. A sound in the corridor made them both turn. Only the house settling, or perhaps a servant passing somewhere beyond the second door. Yet the interruption broke the spell of concentration just enough for Cordelia to realize how near they were standing. She stepped back first. Rowan did the same, though not quickly. Then a loose scrap slid from between the ledger pages and drifted onto the baize. He picked it up. It was no more than a torn memorandum, the lower half missing, but the surviving lines were plain enough. "If M presses for a full inspection, the Hart complaint must stand. Better their pride carry the noise than my books be opened." Crouch had signed only with an E. Rowan read it once, then handed it to her. Cordelia felt the paper tremble very slightly between her fingers. "M," she whispered. "Who was he protecting? And who knew?" The torn memorandum remained between them on the table like a live thing. Cordelia read the line again, then once more, as if repetition might force the missing half of the message to return. It did not. The paper still named only an initial, a Hart complaint, and the calm selfishness of a man determined to let pride take the blame for theft. Rowan drew a long breath. "M may have been a Marchmont. My grandfather, my great-uncle, a clerk, or someone outside the family entirely." "Mallow," Cordelia said. He lifted his eyes to hers. "The name occurred to me." It was the obvious answer, and for that reason both distrusted it at once. Hector Mallow was ambitious enough and cold enough to profit from confusion in the present. But the scrap in Cordelia's hand was old. The ink had browned, the fold lines had worn thin. Unless his line had touched the earlier fraud, the initial might point elsewhere. She laid the fragment beside the open ledger. "If we guess too quickly, we shall make fools of ourselves. We need the official accusations, not merely Crouch's private fear." Rowan nodded. "Then we compare everything. Every board abstract, every rent roll, every complaint from both houses." They worked another hour in the dry hush of the room, until the lamp oil fell low and the air seemed close with paper dust. Cordelia found a copied schedule of hospital grain allowances. Rowan uncovered a packet of steward receipts missing 2 quarters in the year the quarrel had first flared. Nothing yet gave them a final answer. Yet the old certainty had cracked. The feud no longer looked noble, or inevitable, or even respectable. It looked managed. At last Rowan closed the ledger. "You cannot remain here till dawn." "Why not? The dead appear to have done their best work after midnight." That earned from him the nearest thing to amusement she had yet seen. It changed his face more than a smile would have done. For a moment he looked younger, less carved by duty, and the sight of it struck her unexpectedly. He escorted her back through the corridor himself. No servant was summoned, no explanation was offered. Their steps fell in quiet measure over the runner, and the house had gone still around them. When they reached the saloon, Lady Agnes looked up from her embroidery, saw their expressions, and asked no questions. Mrs. Selwyn, however, saw at once that something had shifted. On the drive home, with frost beginning to silver the carriage glass, Mrs. Selwyn kept her counsel for nearly half a mile before saying, "I do not suppose the evening was as simple as dinner." "It was not," Cordelia said. "And the Duke?" Cordelia stared into the dim reflection of her own face in the window. "He is more exacting than I expected." Mrs. Selwyn made a small sound. "That is not what I asked." Cordelia did not answer. The next morning, Hart House felt changed in subtle ways. 2 cards awaited her at breakfast, each from acquaintances who wished to call and admire the engagement. A basket of hothouse flowers had arrived from a cousin who disapproved of nearly everything, and therefore sent lilies in token of reconciliation. The servants moved with heightened attentiveness, as they always did when private news had become public property. Before she had finished her tea, a note from Mrs. Vale requested her presence at Penfold on an accounting matter, and a second note, delivered only minutes later, came from Rowan. "Meet me at the hospital before noon. There is something more. Do not speak of the ledger." That last line stiffened her fingers on the page. When she reached Penfold, the hall smelled of starch, broth, and damp wool drying by the kitchen range. A maid hurried past with folded sheets from the Foundling ward. Mrs. Vale met Cordelia at the stair with unusual gravity. "You are in time," the matron said quietly. "Sister Beatrice is awake and asking for the old steward by name. She says she remembers what happened the winter the accusations began." Mrs. Vale led them up the narrow stair in silence. The boards gave a tired creak underfoot, and the air changed as they climbed. Warmer near the nursery rooms, touched with lavender water, broth, and the clean starch of sheets dried too near a fire. Rowan waited on the landing when Cordelia arrived, hat in hand, his expression unreadable, save for the alertness in it. "She has been asking for Crouch since dawn," he said softly. "Sometimes she drifts, sometimes she is perfectly clear." Cordelia nodded. "Then we must hope for one of her clearer moments." Sister Beatrice lay in a small room under the eaves, propped against pillows gone thin with washing. Her face was all fine bones and parchment skin, but the eyes that opened when Mrs. Vale spoke her name were startlingly bright. A little brazier hissed in the grate. A spoon and medicine cup stood on the coverlet beside a prayer book rubbed smooth at the corners. "Miss Hart," the old nurse whispered. Then her gaze moved, sharpened, and settled on Rowan. "Marchmont." "It is I," he said, stepping nearer. "And we have come to ask about the winter of the shortages, if you are able." At the word shortages, something in her face altered. She did not look confused, she looked offended by memory. "Shortages," she repeated. "That was what they called theft when gentlemen wished to stay gentlemen." Cordelia felt a quick cold move through her. Mrs. Vale drew the curtains closer against the pale day, and the little room narrowed around the bed, the brazier, the 3 listeners, and the voice of a woman who had spent her life among abandoned children and had no patience left for respectable lies. "It was the winter the milk soured twice in 1 week," Beatrice said. "The coal came late. Nurse Hall was sent home in tears because her wages had not been paid. Mr. Crouch kept saying the books would answer for everything, and he smiled too much when he said it." "Did you see him alter them?" Rowan asked. "No, he was careful. But I saw him come from the committee room after dusk with loose papers under his coat, and I heard him speaking in the yard with a gentleman from outside the hospital. I could not see the man's face, only his gloves. Pale kid leather, very fine." Too fine for a steward, too fine for a parish man. Cordelia leaned forward. "Did you hear a name?" The old nurse closed her eyes, searching backward. "No name. Only this. Crouch said, 'Once the Harts are accused,
The board will stop looking at sums and start looking at blood. Her mouth tightened. He knew them well. That sentence settled heavily over the room. Cordelia thought of generations wasting themselves on insult and ceremony, guarding a grievance like a family relic, while the real hand behind it slipped away unmarked. Rowan spoke again, gentler now. "And the gentleman? Did he answer?" "Aye. He said the matter must be kept from inspection until spring." She opened her eyes and fixed them suddenly on Cordelia. "He called your grandfather hot-blooded." He laughed. Cordelia went very still. The room fell quiet except for the soft rattle of the brazier. Rowan thanked Sister Beatrice with a gravity that seemed to soothe her more than any comfort. He adjusted the fallen edge of the blanket without thinking, and Mrs. Vale saw it, and so did Cordelia. When they stepped back into the corridor, the windows there were pearled with a thin mist from the kitchens below.
Neither spoke for a moment. Then Cordelia said, "If Crouch expected the board to stop examining numbers, there must have been some official review due that winter, something he feared." Rowan turned to her. "An audit?" "Yes." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper she had not seen before. "I asked my steward to search Marchmont's old trunks this morning," he said. "He found a list of records transferred after my grandfather's death. One box is missing from the inventory." "What sort of box?" His gaze held hers. "One marked hospital examination papers, and according to the note beside it, it was last sent to Hart House." They left Sister Beatrice's room with the old nurse's words still clinging to them. In the passage outside, the windows were dim with kitchen steam, and below them the house breathed its usual life, pails carried, doors opening and closing, children being settled after broth and bread. Yet to Cordelia, everything sounded altered by that one detail: a missing box, sent somehow to Hart House. "I have never seen it," she said at once. Rowan did not contradict her. "I did not suppose you had." That answer, quiet as it was, mattered. A less careful man might have used the moment to accuse. He did not. He only offered her the folded inventory sheet, and she took it from him beneath the pale wash of the corridor window. The paper was yellowed, the ink thinned by time, but the notation was plain enough. One trunk of hospital examination papers, transferred after the old Duke's death. Destination: Hart House chaplain's study. "My father kept the chaplain's rooms closed after Reverend Hale died," Cordelia said. "He said the place smelled of dust and sermons." "It may smell of more use than that now." She looked up, and to her own annoyance felt the edge of fear sharpen into energy. "Then we go there today." He should have hesitated. It would have been proper to offer delay, or servants, or some committee of witnesses to soften impropriety. Instead, he only asked, "Will Mrs. Selwyn receive me if I arrive within the hour?" "She will receive you with disapproval," Cordelia said, "but she will receive you." The old chaplain's suite stood in a retired corner of Hart House, beyond the morning room and near a side stair no one used unless obliged. By the time Rowan arrived, the winter light had thinned to a watery gray, and a fire had been lit there for the first time in months. Even so, the place retained its own air: dry paper, extinguished candles, worn leather, and that faint mineral smell old walls keep when a room has been closed too long. Mrs. Selwyn came in with them and stayed, which suited Cordelia very well. She carried a ring of keys and an expression of moral endurance. "If I am to assist in rummaging through a dead clergyman's effects with a gentleman not yet married to my niece," she said, "I should like it remembered that I do so entirely for the sake of abandoned infants." "Your sacrifice will be engraved somewhere," Cordelia replied. Mrs. Selwyn sniffed. Rowan, who might once have found the lady formidable, now seemed to understand her. "Then we are grateful for it," he said, and handed her the inventory. That softened her by nearly an inch. The study yielded layers of the past by degrees: sermon books tied in ribbon, parish registers, a broken pair of spectacles in a velvet case, 3 locked drawers containing nothing more scandalous than unpaid subscriptions and dried pens. Dust rose in soft clouds when trunks were opened. Cordelia sneezed once, turned away in irritation, and heard Rowan murmur, "God forbid the county learn you are mortal." She glanced back at him, startled into a smile she had not meant to give. Then came the blue-painted dispatch chest behind the inner screen, half hidden by rolled maps of Glebeland. Mrs. Selwyn found the right key only after trying 4 others and muttering against dead men who preferred secrecy to labels. The lock yielded with a scrape. Inside lay packets of chapel accounts, 2 old visitation reports, and beneath them, flat at the bottom, a bundle wrapped in brown paper and sealed with black thread. Reverend Hale's hand across the front read, "Concerning the hospital examination, keep closed unless compelled." No one spoke. Cordelia felt the room draw tight around them. Rowan set the inventory down very carefully on the desk. Mrs. Selwyn crossed herself by habit, though she would have denied it if challenged. Cordelia reached for the packet. At that same instant, a footman knocked sharply at the outer door and called through the panel, "Miss Hart, beg pardon, but Mr. Hector Mallow has arrived uninvited, and he says he must see you on urgent business at once." Cordelia's hand remained on the sealed packet for 1 charged second longer. Then she lifted it from the dispatch chest and passed it straight to Mrs. Selwyn. "Keep this with you," she said. "Do not let it out of your sight." Mrs. Selwyn clutched it at once against the folds of her gown, her eyes widening despite herself. "Am I to understand that I have become a courier of state secrets?" "Of hospital papers," Cordelia said, "which may be more dangerous." Rowan moved to the door before the footman could knock again. The quickness of it told her he had read the moment exactly as she had. If Hector Mallow had arrived by chance, he was troublesome. If he had arrived because he suspected what they were doing, he was worse. "Show Mr. Mallow into the blue drawing room," Rowan said through the panel. "Miss Hart will attend him presently." There was the smallest pause outside. Even servants noticed tones. "Yes, Your Grace." When the footsteps retreated, Cordelia turned back to the room. Dust still hung in the candlelight above the open chest. The old study smelled of dry paper, lamp smoke, and disturbed cloth covers. It felt suddenly exposed. "He cannot have known about this packet," she said. "No," Rowan answered, "but he may have known we were searching." Mrs. Selwyn, who had gone rather pale, pressed the bundle tighter to her middle. "If he means to walk in upon the 3 of us and discover my niece with a duke among unopened boxes and secret papers, I shall expire on the hearth and trouble you both no further." "You will do no such thing," Cordelia said. "You will take that packet to my dressing-room, lock it in the ebony cabinet, and send my maid to sit there until I return." Mrs. Selwyn drew herself up. "Yes, very good." She went out by the inner passage without waiting for assistance. Rowan watched the door close behind her, then looked back at Cordelia. "You should not face Mallow alone." "And yet I must appear willing to do so." She reached for the nearest stack of parish papers and set them in disorder on the desk. "If he sees too much arrangement, he will smell fear." That drew from him a brief look of unwilling admiration. "You are very dangerous when practical." "So I have been told." For one fleeting instant, the tension between them changed shape. It did not lessen, but it warmed. Then the business of the moment returned. The blue drawing room had been opened only a quarter-hour earlier, and still held that shut-up chill old room's keep even after a fire is lit. Mallow stood with his back to the grate, elegant as ever, one hand beneath his coat, the other turning a porcelain shepherdess on the mantel, as if he already belonged among Hart possessions. He bowed deeply when Cordelia entered. Rowan came in beside her and did not pretend accident. "Miss Hart, Your Grace," Mallow said. "Forgive this intrusion. I feared delay." Cordelia remained standing. "You feared many things, I think. Which one brings you here?" His smile was smooth. "Your welfare, naturally." Rowan said nothing. He had taken a place near the window, not crowding the room, not yielding it either. Mallow noticed. Men like him always noticed the exact shape of resistance. "I hear," Mallow continued, "that the commissioners have advanced the date of the charter hearing. There is concern in town that appearances may not satisfy them. A hurried engagement, however charming, can look very thin under official eyes." Cordelia kept her gaze steady. "You did not come to discuss appearances." "No, I came to warn you." He lowered his voice. "If your understanding with Marchmont is merely strategic, if it was formed to influence the hearing, the consequences could be severe, for you especially." "For me?" "A lady is always judged more cruelly." That was well chosen. It had enough truth in it to be poisonous. Cordelia felt the trap in the sentence and refused it. "How thoughtful of you." Mallow's eyes moved just once to Rowan. "I should be deeply grieved to see Miss Hart made vulnerable by advice that serves another house more than her own." The insult landed where he meant it to. Rowan's face did not alter, but something colder entered the room. Before either could answer, a maid slipped in with a salver and a visiting card she said had been left at the door only moments before. Cordelia took it. The card bore no name, only a line in an unfamiliar hand. "Ask Mallow where the missing hospital box went after Reverend Hale died. He knows." The card was small enough to hide in a palm, and Cordelia did exactly that. She let her fingers close over it before either man could ask for it, though Rowan had already seen from her face that something in those few words mattered. Mallow noticed the movement as well. "A difficulty?" he asked gently. "Only a foolish interruption," Cordelia replied. He gave a little bow of concern that was more insolent than open rudeness would have been. "I should be sorry to intrude upon family business." "You are not family," Rowan said. The words were quiet, but the room seemed to contract around them. Firelight moved over the blue silk walls. Outside, a branch tapped the window pane in the wind, light and persistent, like a finger seeking entry. Mallow's gaze shifted toward the Duke, and for the first time that afternoon something naked passed through it. Annoyance, quickly mastered. "I spoke in the broader sense," he said. "Miss Hart's welfare must be of concern to all her friends." Cordelia turned the anonymous card once inside her glove, feeling the raised edge of the pasteboard against her skin. "Ask Mallow where the missing hospital box went after Reverend Hale died. He knows." It could be truth. It could be mischief. It could be a desperate move from someone who feared speaking aloud. Whatever it was, it had arrived at the exact moment Mallow tried to shake her confidence. That in itself was useful. She lifted her chin. "Then perhaps you may satisfy a curiosity of mine, Mr. Mallow." He smiled again. "Gladly." "My late father's chaplain received certain hospital papers years ago, an old examination file. The record of it survives, but the box itself does not. Have you any knowledge of what became of it after Reverend Hale died?" There are silences which merely pause a conversation, and there are silences that expose it. This was the latter kind. Mallow did not answer at once. It was only a second, perhaps less, but he had been too smooth all afternoon for any hesitation not to matter. "None at all," he said. Rowan, standing by the window, crossed one arm loosely behind his back. You seemed very concerned just now with the hospital's legal security. I had imagined your acquaintance with its history was equally thorough. I am interested in its future, Your Grace, not in every dead clergyman's trunk. Cordelia watched him carefully. How odd. You speak as though you knew where the box had been kept. That landed. His expression did not break, but it tightened. A guess only. Old papers are always kept in trunks, cabinets, attics, or cellars. Your question gives more weight to this lost bundle than I think it deserves. Perhaps, she said. He tried another path then, and it was a clever one. He softened his voice and addressed her almost privately, though Rowan stood 4 paces away and heard every word. Miss Hart, forgive me if I speak plainly. You are being drawn into a dangerous haste. The county is already talking. The commissioners are not sentimental men. If there are irregularities in these arrangements, I would grieve to see the blame rest upon you, while others retain title and consequence. So that was the shape of his attack. Not open accusation, division. He meant to make her doubt Rowan's honor before she had time to test it. She might once have been vulnerable to that. A week ago, certainly. But the past days had changed something small and stubborn in her. She had seen the Duke over unpaid bills, fading records, damaged roofs, old grievances, frightened nurses, and a ward full of children who could not eat. County gossip. Men pretending virtue generally dislike arithmetic. Rowan, she had discovered, did not. The danger to me, she said evenly, is not haste. It is listening too long to people who profit from delay. Mallow's eyes cooled. Before he could answer, a servant entered with a message on a salver for the Duke. Rowan read it once, and his expression sharpened. It is from Fenric, he said. The commissioners have altered the order of review. They will hear objections before accepting any declaration of unity. Mallow's mouth curved very slightly, and Cordelia, with that card still hidden in her hand, understood that someone had begun to move faster than they had. No one spoke for a moment after Rowan read Fenric's note. The fire gave a low sigh in the grate. Mallow, still perfectly dressed and perfectly watchful, lowered his eyes in a display of concern that convinced no one in the room. What unfortunate haste, he said. Official minds do so love suspicion. Cordelia folded the anonymous card more tightly inside her glove until the edge pressed into her palm. She had the strongest desire to thrust the question at him then and there, to demand what he knew of Reverend Hale's missing box, and watch his face without warning. But impulse had fed this quarrel long enough. If there was proof to be had, it would not be won by anger before a witness who lied gracefully. "We are grateful for your concern," she said, "though I fear you have stayed too long to be comfortable." That, at least, he understood. He bowed. Rowan did not move from the window until Mallow had crossed the room and reached the door. There the man turned once more, his hand on the latch. "If I may offer one last word, Miss Hart, gentlemen will survive this matter better than ladies. Remember that." Then he was gone. The door closed. Silence came back in behind him. Rowan crossed to her at once. "What was on the card?" She drew it from her glove and handed it over. His eyes moved quickly across the line, and a darker expression settled over his face. "He knows," Cordelia said quietly. "Or someone wishes us to think he does." "Yes." Rowan looked toward the door through which Mallow had vanished. "Either way, he is entangled." She felt the strain of the afternoon all at once, the hidden packet, the altered order of the review, the old ledger, the old nurse's memory, Mallow's smile. The room seemed close with heat and perfume and the stale sweetness of cut flowers on the side table. She moved to the hearth
and stood with one hand on the marble, trying to think cleanly. "The packet," she said. "Mrs. Selwyn has it." "Then we read it now." They found her in Cordelia's dressing room, planted in a straight-backed chair beside the ebony cabinet with the air of a loyal sentinel who expected death but meant to be correct about it. When Rowan entered behind Cordelia, Mrs. Selwyn raised her brows and said, "I have decided that if this is treason, I shall require tea before I am hanged." "No one is to be hanged," Cordelia said. "That is exactly what people say before unfortunate developments." Still, she surrendered the packet. They returned to the old chaplain's study and broke the thread there. Inside lay 3 folded papers and a memorandum in Reverend Hale's narrow hand. Dust lifted as Rowan opened the first sheet. Cordelia came close beside him to read. It was not a formal audit after all, but a private note written by Hale after the examination papers had arrived. He recorded that the hospital accounts had shown marks of amendment by a later hand, and that he had delayed sending the matter onward because a gentleman connected to the lesser Mallow interest urged silence until tempers cooled. The second paper was a partial comparison of entries, some matching the discrepancies she and Rowan had already found. The third was worse. Hale wrote that he feared the original examination box had been tampered with after its arrival at Hart House, and that he meant to remove certain pages for safekeeping apart from the rest. Rowan read the line twice. "Certain pages." Cordelia's pulse quickened. "Which means this is still incomplete." Mrs. Selwyn leaned forward. "Then where are the removed pages?" Cordelia turned over the final memorandum. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, Reverend Hale had added one brief direction. "If I am prevented, the remaining proofs are to be sought beneath St. Matthew." The 3 of them stared at the words, and after a beat, Rowan said very quietly, "There is no St. Matthew at Hart House." Mrs. Selwyn was the first to recover. "There is a St. Matthew at Penfold," she said. "Or there was when I was a girl. A painted panel in the chapel, Matthew with a book and an inkhorn. Hideous colors, if I recall." Cordelia turned to her at once. "Are you certain?" "As certain as one can be about bad church art seen before a scarlet fever dinner." Mrs. Selwyn drew her shawl tighter. "The founder had all 4 evangelists painted behind the communion rail. The children used to be marched past them on Sundays." Rowan had already taken up the packet again, reading Hale's note as if another sentence might appear by force of attention. "If he removed pages for safekeeping, the chapel would make sense. Private enough for concealment, public enough to revisit without remark." Cordelia was thinking ahead in the same instant. The hospital chapel stood at the older end of the building, near the little cloister yard and the disused schoolroom. Few people entered now except on formal days. The younger children attended prayers in the newer hall when weather was poor. A hiding place could have survived there for years. "We go now," she said. The winter afternoon was already lowering when they crossed from Hart House to Penfold. The sky had the color of cold pewter, and the gravel of the carriage sweep gave a brittle sound beneath their steps. Mrs. Selwyn refused to accompany them farther than the matron's parlor. "I have done my duty by secret packets," she said. "If you mean to crawl behind saints, you may do so without me." Mrs. Vale, however, came herself with a key ring at her waist. She listened without exclamation while Cordelia explained Hale's line, then only said, "The old chapel smells of mice and hymn books, but if truth has taken refuge there, we will not leave it in the dark." The chapel door stuck before it yielded. A faint chill breathed out at once, carrying dust, old wax, and damp stone. Rowan took the lamp from the matron and entered first. The place was small, narrow, and very still.
The founders' memorial tablet stood along one wall.
The painted evangelists, dim with age and smoke, watched from their panels behind the rail, Mark with the lion, Luke with the ox, John with the eagle, and Matthew indeed with a book laid open upon his knee. "There," Mrs. Selwyn had said, and there he was. Cordelia moved closer. Time had darkened the painted face almost to shadow, but the book remained bright enough to catch the eye. She ran her gloved fingers lightly over the carved frame. "Hale wrote beneath St. Matthew," she said. "Not behind, not within." Rowan lowered the lamp. The gold paint on the book's lower edge had worn away oddly, as though touched more often than the surrounding wood. Mrs. Vale saw it too. "That is no ordinary wear." Rowan tried the frame. Nothing. Cordelia crouched and looked lower, where the panel met the rail. One small brass tack sat newer than the others, dull but not ancient. She pressed it. Something gave with a soft click. The painted book sprang outward by half an inch. For one suspended breath, none of them moved. Then Rowan opened the little hidden door, and within the cavity lay a wrapped oilskin packet no larger than a prayer manual. Cordelia felt her pulse beat hard in her throat as he placed it in her hands. The oilskin was dry, carefully sealed, waiting. And on the outer fold, in Hale's narrow hand, was written one more line: "To be opened only in the presence of both houses." For a moment, the only sound in the chapel was the tiny hiss of the lamp flame. The hidden packet lay in Cordelia's hands, its oilskin cool and slightly rough beneath her fingers, and Reverend Hale's instructions seemed to bind the very air around them. "In the presence of both houses," Mrs. Vale repeated quietly. He meant to leave no room for another private quarrel. Rowan's gaze rested on the packet, then lifted to Cordelia's face. "Then it must be opened here. Now." There was something solemn in the simplicity of it. No solicitor, no steward, no relation to interpret, amend, or delay. Only the two heirs, the matron, the old chapel, and a dead clergyman who had trusted secrecy only so far as necessity required. Cordelia nodded. "Open it." He did not take it from her. Instead, he drew a small knife from his pocket and waited while she held the bundle steady between them. The blade slid under the cord. The knot loosened. Oilskin unfolded with a faint, dry crackle, and inside lay several sheets, one narrow account page, and a letter, sealed but never sent. Mrs. Vale moved the lamp closer. The account page spoke first, even before the letter did. It was one of the missing examination leaves, marked in 2 hands. The original entries listed rents received for hospital lands and payments disbursed to nurses, grain merchants, and a coal supplier. Across them, in later ink, alterations had been made, sums reduced, a payment erased, another shifted into a different column. Beside one corrected figure, Reverend Hale had written in the margin, "Crouch hand. Compare with board abstract." Cordelia felt the old fury rise in her, clean and cold. "There it is." "Yes," Rowan said. His voice had gone very level. "There it is." But it was the unsent letter that struck deepest. Hale had addressed it to Alastair Hart and Julian, Duke of Marchmont, both by name, on the same sheet, with no courtesy to hide behind. He wrote that the examination had revealed deliberate false amendment by Ezekiel Crouch, likely made to conceal long thefts from the hospital accounts. He warned that a gentleman connected with the lesser Mallow interest had tried to suppress inquiry for fear of disgrace spreading beyond one office. He urged both houses to meet at once, privately, before public accusation hardened into feud. At the bottom, the letter broke off mid-thought. The ink trailed. There was no signature.
Mrs. Vale crossed herself softly. "He meant to stop it." "And failed," Cordelia said. Rowan took the page from her, not abruptly, but with the care of a man touching evidence and inheritance together. His thumb rested for a second over the two names written side by side. Alistair Hart, Julian Marchmont. Not enemies, then. Not yet. If this had been delivered, he said, none of it need have followed. Cordelia looked at him. Unless pride intervened before truth arrived. That landed between them because it was not only about the dead. The lamp threw gold along the planes of his face, and in that narrow chapel, beneath painted saints and peeling blue, each saw too much of the other too clearly. He was not aloof now, only grave, tired, and very much alive to the cost of what they had inherited. She was not merely proud. She was hurt by the thought that so much ruin had grown from stubborn silence, because she knew how easily she herself might have helped it grow. Mrs. Vale, practical as ever, gathered the papers into better order. "These must be copied tonight," she said, "and hidden better than before." "Yes," Rowan answered, though his eyes were still on Cordelia. Then footsteps sounded in the cloister passage outside. Quick ones, not the measured tread of a servant on ordinary business, but a pace sharpened by purpose. The chapel door opened, and Lady Agnes stood there, breath faintly misting in the cold. "Forgive me," she said. "I came straight from Marchmont. Fenric has sent word again. Hector Mallow has formally petitioned leave to address the commissioners himself, and he means to challenge the engagement before you can present a single page." Lady Agnes's news struck the chapel like a draught through a cracked pane. The little flame in the lamp wavered. So, for a moment, did every plan they had made. Mrs. Vale gathered the recovered papers against her apron, as if someone might snatch them from the air. "How soon?" "Tomorrow the petition will be entered," Lady Agnes said. "The commissioners mean to hear objections first. Mallow has asked to speak to the authenticity of this engagement before the hospital's accounts are considered." Cordelia looked toward the painted St. Matthew with its hidden cavity now standing open. So much of the truth had come to them at last, and yet the timing seemed almost cruel. Proof was one thing. Proof delivered after the room had been poisoned was another. Rowan was already thinking beyond the shock. She could see it in him. The stillness in his face had changed from surprise to calculation. "Then we do not wait for Fenric," he said. "We prepare copies tonight. We place Hale's note, the altered page, the ledger fragment, and Sister Beatrice's testimony in order." "And if Mallow attacks the engagement first?" Cordelia asked. His gaze came to her directly. "Then we withstand it." It was a hard answer because it was honest. Nothing in their evidence altered the fact that the engagement had begun as strategy. Nothing could. The truth that might save the hospital from the old fraud did not cleanse the present deception. Mrs. Vale said quietly, "The children cannot endure another century of adult vanity." No one disputed her. Back at Hart House, the long drawing room became a war room by lamplight. Papers spread across the rosewood table. Mrs. Selwyn copied names in a hand more forceful than graceful. Lady Agnes dictated dates from memory. Rowan compared the altered examination page against Crouch's ledger. Cordelia sorted the documents into possible sequence: what proved theft, what proved concealment, what only suggested guilt and must not be overstated. The room smelled of sealing wax, hot tea gone cold, and the faint singe of lamp oil. The work steadied her. It always did. Yet beneath the practical labor ran another strain, thinner and more dangerous. Every time she looked up, Rowan was there, grave, sleepless, exact, and entirely without theatrical comfort. He did not tell her all would be well. He simply remained.
At one point, near midnight, Mrs. Selwyn rose with a groan and declared that no scandal in England was worth cramped fingers. Lady Agnes followed her to the sideboard in search of stronger tea. For the first time in an hour, Cordelia and Rowan were alone at the table. He handed her a copied page. Their fingers touched. The contact was slight, yet both felt it with absurd clarity. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I rarely do what is advisable." She almost answered lightly, then heard the fatigue in his voice and looked at him more closely. His cravat was loosened. A shadow of weariness stood under his eyes, and beneath all that discipline, something else had begun to live there, something she had no safe name for. "Rowan," she said. The name came out before she had chosen it. He went still. It was the first time she had used it. No title, no careful distance, just Rowan. The room seemed to hear. Slowly, very slowly, he answered, "Cordelia." The answering use of her name did not sound like pretense. It sounded like the crossing of a threshold neither of them had meant to approach so soon. Before either could say more, a knock came at the door. A footman entered, carrying a folded paper on a tray, his face unusually strained. "For Miss Hart," he said. "Left by hand at the servants' entrance. The man who brought it would not give his name." Cordelia opened it. The note was brief, written in hurried ink. "If Mallow speaks first, he will produce a copy of your engagement memorandum." She looked up sharply. Rowan's expression changed at once. "What is it?" Her throat tightened around the words. "He has proof," she said, "or thinks he does." The note lay on the table between the copied pages like a small venomous thing. No one in the room mistook its meaning. If Hector Mallow held even one true copy of their engagement memorandum, then he possessed exactly the weapon he needed, not to disprove the old fraud, but to make every honest document they had found look convenient. Mrs. Selwyn sank slowly into her chair. Then which cheerful idiot allowed such a paper to circulate? "Fenrick's chambers," Rowan said. His voice had gone very still. "A draft was made there before the final terms were settled." Lady Agnes lifted her brows. "And barristers' clerks gossip, copyists gossip, footmen marry copyists' daughters. Half the county is built on ink and loose tongues." Cordelia should have felt anger first. Instead, what came was something colder. Exposure. Not fear for herself alone, though there was that too. If Mallow spoke first, if he read out the plain bargain they had made to preserve the hospital, then every affectionate glance, every public appearance, every dinner at Marchmont, every ride, every softening look the county had noticed, all of it would be dragged into ridicule before the commissioners ever reached the forged accounts. Mrs. Vale, practical even in crisis, gathered the most sensitive papers into 2 packets. "This changes nothing about the truth." "No," Cordelia said. "Only about whether anyone will hear it." The room fell quiet after that. The clock on the mantel ticked on with offensive calm. Outside, somewhere deep in the house, a servant closed shutters against the wind. Their time had narrowed. That much all of them could feel. Lady Agnes was the first to speak again. "If Mallow has a memorandum, we must assume he also has enough wit to present it with tears for the poor children and grave concern for Miss Hart's reputation. Men like him prefer moral outrage when greed alone looks ugly." Mrs. Selwyn made a low sound of disgust. "He will dare too much." "He will dare precisely what may succeed," Rowan answered. Cordelia looked at him. The lamp showed the tension he kept hidden from everyone else, the firm set of his mouth, the weariness in his eyes, and beneath both, anger controlled so tightly it almost looked like composure. He was not thinking of his pride. He was thinking ahead to the hearing, to what must be admitted, what must be defended, and what might be lost.
That steadied her more than comfort would have done. "We cannot stop him from speaking," she said. "Then we must decide now what we will do when he does." No one answered at once, because they all understood the real shape of the question. If attacked, they could deny, they could evade, they could cling to appearances and hope the commissioners preferred a smooth lie to a difficult truth. Or they could tell everything, and place the hospital in the hands of men who might punish honesty less than deception. Mrs. Vale, who had seen too many children left to suffer by the pride of their elders, said simply, "I would rather beg bread for this house than save it through a second fraud." Rowan's gaze shifted from the matron to Cordelia. She felt the weight of it with painful clarity. The false engagement had been her choice as much as his. The danger now belonged equally to them. Yet beneath that public crisis there was another, quieter one she had not meant to face so soon. If the lie were stripped away entirely, what remained between them? As if some treacherous part of her mind had chosen the worst possible moment for truth, she knew the answer. Too much. Lady Agnes rose to leave, taking Mrs. Selwyn with her under the excuse of rest. Mrs. Vale carried away one packet for safekeeping in the hospital strong press. When the door closed, only Cordelia and Rowan remained in the dim drawing room, the fire lowered, the evidence spread before them like the broken bones of an old injustice. At length he said, "If he forces the matter, I will not let you stand alone in it." She looked up, and then, before she could answer, a second knock sounded at the door. A servant entered with a sealed envelope and said, "For Miss Hart, from Mr. Hector Mallow's own hand. He said it was to be delivered before dawn." Cordelia broke the seal. Inside was a copied page of the memorandum, and one short line beneath it. "Withdraw quietly by morning, and your disgrace need never be public." The copied page trembled once in Cordelia's hand before she forced it still. Mallow had been careful in his cruelty. He had not written to threaten the hospital. He had written to threaten her name. "Withdraw quietly by morning, and your disgrace need never be public." Rowan took the sheet from her and read it without comment. Only when he had finished did he fold it once and place it beside the other papers. "He means to unnerve you before dawn," he said. "He has succeeded." The admission cost her. She hated the sound of it, hated the weakness in the words, hated most of all that weakness had been made from something she herself had chosen. The false engagement had seemed practical when the danger was legal and distant. On paper, one might survive paper. But public shame was another matter. The county would not remember forged ledgers and hidden packets. It would remember a woman exposed as bargaining with her own future. Lady Agnes, who had seen more of the world than most people guessed, said nothing sentimental. "Then we must learn where that copy escaped." "Fenric," Rowan said at once. He sent for the solicitor before midnight, and to the man's credit, or perhaps merely to his fear, he came. Mr. Fenric arrived with his cravat tied in haste and his face ashen under the lamp. In the library, with the incriminating page before him, he wilted by degrees rather than all at once. "I had a clerk make a clean draft," he admitted. "Only one. It was destroyed after signature, at least, I believed it was." "You believed," Rowan repeated. Fenric swallowed. "There was a copying boy in the outer room that day, and Mallow has done business in my offices before. I cannot prove—" "No," Rowan said. "You cannot." Cordelia stood at the hearth and listened. She scarcely heard the rest. The smell of hot wax, leather, and dying coals seemed to thicken around her. Outside, the night had gone black against the windows. Her humiliation now had a root, a desk, a clerk, a hand, an errand boy. It had traveled like gossip always traveled, from room to room, mouth to mouth, until it reached the one man who could use it best. When Fenric had gone, dismissed with a coldness that needed no raised voice, Cordelia spoke without turning. "We must end it." Silence met the words. Then Rowan said, "No." She faced him. "You do not understand." "I understand exactly. If Mallow reads that memorandum before the commissioners, I become a schemer who sold herself for influence, and you become a duke who borrowed a woman's reputation for convenience. Every kindness between us will be laughed at. Every appearance will be taken for calculation. The hospital will be dragged through filth, and all of it will be my doing." "No," he said again, and this time the word carried force. "The filth is Mallow's. The theft was Crouch's. The concealment belonged to men long dead. I will not hear you gather their sins and lay them at your own feet because society prefers a woman to bleed for everyone else's comfort." She stared at him. The room had narrowed to the two of them, to the firelight on his face and the anger he no longer bothered to conceal. "You speak as if that changes what tomorrow will look like." "It changes what I will permit." "And what can you permit, Rowan?" The name came sharp with hurt. Mockery does not wound men as it wounds women. His expression altered, not with offense, but with something deeper, more pained. "Then let it wound me first." A knock sounded at the door. A servant entered, carrying a sealed official packet on a tray. "From the commissioner's office, Your Grace, for both of you." Rowan broke the seal. His eyes moved down the page, then lifted to Cordelia. "The hearing is at 10, he said quietly, "and Mallow is to be heard before us." After the official packet was opened, the house seemed to sink into a different kind of silence. It was no longer the quiet of night in a well-governed estate. It was the waiting hush before judgment, when even the lamps burn as if they know they are being watched. Cordelia did not go to bed. She stood for a long time at the window of the small withdrawing room Lady Agnes had pressed upon her, one candle burning low beside her, the glass black with the reflection of her own face. Beyond it, the lawn was only a darker strip against the dark. Somewhere at the far side of the house a shutter knocked once, then again, irregularly, in the wind. Tomorrow at 10, Mallow first. She had thought herself equal to scandal when it had been only an idea, thought herself practical enough, hard enough, to endure what must be endured for the sake of the hospital. But now that disgrace had been given a time, a room, and witnesses, she felt its shape with humiliating clarity, not as abstraction, as breath catching in her throat, as heat under the skin, as the certainty that 100 eyes would watch her while a man read out the terms by which she had bartered appearances. A knock came, soft enough not to startle. "Come in," she said. Rowan entered without ceremony. He had removed his coat, and the severity of his appearance was less formal now, though no less grave. He closed the door behind him and remained near it for a moment, as if offering her the chance to dismiss him. She did not. "I thought you might still be awake," he said. "I had intended to be sensible and sleep peacefully," she answered. "It appears I have failed." A faint, tired warmth moved through his expression and vanished again. He crossed the room then, but only as far as the hearth. The fire there had burned low. He stirred it once with the poker, and a thread of sparks rose. For a while, neither spoke. It was a companionable silence in form, but not in feeling. Too much stood inside it. At last, Cordelia said, "If we deny the memorandum and he produces it, we are ruined." "Yes." "If we evade, we look guilty." "Yes." "And if we tell the truth," her voice thinned for a moment, "we may still lose everything." Rowan set down the poker. "We may." She turned from the window then. "You say it so calmly." "I am not calm." The answer came fast enough to stop her. He looked at her fully now, and she saw what restraint had hidden. Not the cold Duke,
not the careful ally. A man driven beyond patience, beyond pride, and very near pain. "I am angry," he said, "at Mallow, at Fenrick, at the dead who let this rot pass for honor, at myself for asking this of you in the first place." His voice lowered. "And I am afraid, Cordelia." She had never heard him say such a thing. "For the hospital?" she asked. "For you first," he said. The room seemed to contract around those words. The small candle flame bent in its draught. Somewhere below stairs, a clock began striking the quarter. He took one step nearer. "If he forces the matter tomorrow," Rowan said, "I will not let you bear the shame alone. We tell the truth before he can use it as a whip, all of it. The bargain, the reason, the evidence, the rest. Let the commissioners judge us on what is real." Cordelia drew a slow breath. The fear remained. So did something else now, something deeper and far more dangerous than fear. "And if truth is not enough?" she whispered. His gaze did not leave hers. "Then before God and half the county," he said, "I shall have one more truth to speak." Morning came hard and colorless. Frost filmed the carriage glass in pale ferns, and the road to the commissioner's hall lay under a sky the color of old pewter. Cordelia sat opposite Rowan, with her hands folded too tightly in her lap, feeling every turn of the wheels as if each one carried her nearer not only to judgment, but to exposure. Neither spoke much on the drive. There are moments, perhaps you know them, when words become too small for the truth pressing behind them. The silence between those two was not empty. It was full of decisions already made in the night, and of one still hanging, unnamed, between them. When the carriage stopped, the sound outside told its own story. Too many voices, too many horses. Too many people who had no business caring and cared all the more because scandal had touched charity and rank together. The steps to the hall were crowded with servants, local gentlemen, 2 newspapermen pretending not to be newspapermen, and ladies who had discovered urgent errands in the neighborhood. A footman opened the door. Cold air struck in at once. Rowan got down first and turned to offer his hand. Cordelia took it. He did not release her at once. The gesture was small, necessary, entirely proper for an affianced pair mounting a public stair. Yet his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that reached far deeper than etiquette, and she climbed beside him with the strange sensation that the whole county had narrowed to the warmth of one hand in winter. Inside, the commissioner's chamber smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and cold stones slowly yielding to fire. A long table stood at the front beneath tall windows filmed with morning mist. Clerks bent over papers. Trustees sat rigidly upright. Mr. Fenrick, diminished and anxious, kept to the side under the watch of a younger barrister Rowan had engaged at dawn. Mrs. Vale was present too, black-gowned and composed, her face pale but determined. And there, in the row reserved for petitioners, sat Hector Mallow. He rose when Cordelia entered, as courtesy required. He even bowed. If one had not known him, one might have taken him for an injured benefactor dragged unwillingly into unpleasantness by the follies of others. That was the genius of his kind. They made ambition look like wounded principle. The chief commissioner, a narrow-faced man with silver hair and severe cuffs, called the room to order. The scrape of chairs ceased, papers were arranged, pens lifted. The sound of one child coughing somewhere in a distant corridor, perhaps from the public rooms below, faded, and after that there was nothing but official silence. The petition was read first, Crown Charter renewal. Objection lodged concerning the sufficiency and good faith of the proposed reconciliation between Hart and Marchmont. Leave granted for Mr. Hector Mallow to address the panel. He did so with measured sorrow. He spoke of the hospital's sacred purpose,
of the need for trustees above reproach, of his reluctance to bring private pain into public consideration. Then, with exquisite regret, he produced the copied page of the engagement memorandum. A murmur moved through the room like wind through dry leaves. Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face, yet she did not look away. Mallow read the cold contractual lines aloud: time period, public cooperation, mutual obligations, implied end after the hearing. He omitted nothing that injured. He concluded by suggesting that if the entire appearance of unity rested upon contrivance, then every representation since made to the commissioners must be regarded as tainted. When he finished, the chief commissioner turned his grave eyes toward the pair at the center of the storm. "Miss Hart," he said, "Your Grace, is this document authentic? Was your announced engagement entered into for the purpose of influencing this hearing?" Rowan moved, but before he could speak, Cordelia rose. Her knees were not steady, her voice was. "Yes," she said. The room seemed to inhale. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at the commissioners. "But that is not the whole of it." The murmur that followed Cordelia's admission was brief, shocked, and then ruthlessly contained by the gavel at the commissioners' table. Public bodies, when they wish to preserve dignity, become very quiet after hearing something indecorous. Cordelia remained standing. Her hands were cold. She could feel every eye in the room, some hostile, some hungry, some suddenly sympathetic in the way sympathy can become almost another humiliation when it arrives from strangers. Yet the moment she had dreaded for nights had already broken. The memorandum existed. The pretense could not be protected. There was, oddly, a kind of freedom in that. "It is true," she said. "The engagement was first proposed because the hospital stood in danger, and because the law governing it had become absurd enough to punish children for old family quarrels. I agreed to it, freely, knowing it was a fiction." Across the room, Mallow lowered his eyes like a man wounded by honesty. She did not look at him again. "But," she continued, "while attempting to preserve the endowment, the Duke of Marchmont and I discovered that the grievance dividing our houses was itself built upon a false account, a forged one." That stirred the chamber more sharply than her confession had done. Commissioners leaned forward, pens lifted. Even the chief among them lost a fraction of his practiced coldness. Rowan stood then, and by standing beside her rather than before her, he altered the meaning of the room. He was not shielding, he was joining. He spoke without flourish. He confirmed the memorandum, the false beginning, the shared intention to satisfy the Crown's demand for visible unity. Then he set out the evidence in order, each piece placed with calm precision into the hands of the clerk: Ezekiel Crouch's private ledger, the altered examination page recovered from St. Matthew's panel in the chapel, Reverend Hale's unfinished warning, Sister Beatrice's testimony, the memorandum fragment naming the Hart accusation as cover for opened books never to be opened. Mrs. Vale was called. She spoke plainly. No embroidered grief, no theatrics, only years of institutional memory and the old nurse's report. Lady Agnes and Mrs. Selwyn sat rigid as carved oak, hearing family pride dismantled line by line. When the clerk read aloud Hale's sentence concerning a gentleman connected with the lesser Mallow interest, the turn in the room was palpable. Hector Mallow rose at once. "That phrase proves nothing. A clergyman's suspicion is not guilt." "No," said Rowan, "but the forged page is guilt. The altered sums are guilt. The suppression of the examination is guilt. And your great-uncle's tenancy of hospital land at half value, recorded in the same season, is at the very least convenient." That last document had been found only hours before among copied rental schedules and set quietly in readiness. It landed now with devastating neatness. The room, so eager a moment ago to feast on scandal, began to see a larger appetite at work than romance. Still, the chief commissioner did not yield. He sat back, steepled his fingers, and looked from the memorandum to the forged accounts, from Cordelia to Rowan, from Mallow to the hospital matron. "The old grievance may indeed have rested upon deceit," he said. "But the question before this panel remains immediate. If the proposed union was false when publicly declared, upon what ground are we to credit the present reconciliation as anything but another convenience?" There it was, the one blade that all their evidence could not blunt. Cordelia felt the room hold its breath. Rowan did not look toward the commissioners first. He turned to her. When Rowan turned to her, the chamber itself seemed to fall away. The commissioners remained at their table, the clerks with their pens, Mallow with his injured expression, the crowded benches full of county faces tilted forward in anticipation. Yet for one, held instant, none of them mattered as much as the fact that he was looking only at her. There was no haste in him now, no tactic, no legal neatness. He spoke as a man who had arrived, by whatever humiliating road, at truth and meant to stand there. "My Lord Commissioners," he said, but his eyes did not leave Cordelia's face. "The lady and I did indeed begin with an arrangement. That is the shame of it, and I will not conceal my part. But the present question before you is whether what now stands between us is still arrangement." A clerk's pen scratched once, then stopped. "In the past weeks," Rowan continued, "I have worked beside Miss Hart in hospital accounts, tenant disputes, roof estimates, wage schedules, old papers, and older wrongs. I have seen her in difficulty, in anger, in fatigue, and in unmerited humiliation. I have found her honest where others were politic, steadfast where others were ornamental, and braver than any person has a right to demand." Cordelia's breath caught. She could do nothing about it. The room was very still. He went on, and the reserve that had so long governed him now gave way not to extravagance, but to something far rarer, public sincerity without defense. "If you require me to say whether I trust her, I do. If you require me to say whether I honor her, I do. If you ask whether I wish the engagement withdrawn now that its first purpose has failed," here for the first time his voice altered, "I do not." A visible current ran through the chamber. Mallow half rose, then thought better of it. Rowan took one step toward Cordelia, only one, enough. "I cannot ask you to credit a false vow," he said to the commissioners, and then plainly to her. "So I withdraw the false one." Every face in the room turned from him to her and back again. "Cordelia Hart," he said. He used her name not softly, not dramatically, but with the quiet gravity of a man laying down rank and self-protection together. "I love you. I did not mean to. I did not intend any part of this beyond the hospital's rescue. Yet if I leave this room without speaking truth, I shall deserve every contempt already earned by our houses. I ask you now, before these witnesses and without bargain of any kind, will you be my wife?" Even the windows seemed to hold their frost in place. Cordelia stood within the wreckage of every defense she had once admired in herself. Pride, caution, the old vow never to need any person more than duty required, all of it had carried her faithfully up to this very edge, and none of it could answer him now. She saw, with startling clarity, the first meeting in Hart House, the hospital ledgers, the old chapel, the winter roads, his anger on her behalf, his patience with the matron, the steadiness of his hand at the carriage door, the simple fact that he had seen her exactly as she was and had not asked her to grow smaller. When she spoke, her voice trembled only once. "Yes," she said. Then, because one word felt too thin for what had passed between them, she said it again. "Yes, Rowan, gladly." A sound moved through the room, unlike the earlier murmur of scandal. It was not gossip now. It was shock giving way to relief, disbelief, and something perilously like hope. Mallow came to his feet at last. "This is theater," he said sharply. "A performance mounted at the very bar of review." But the chief commissioner raised his hand, and for the first time Hector Mallow was not the man controlling the room. The silver-haired official looked from Rowan to Cordelia, then down at the forged page, the memorandum, the recovered papers, and the long chain of pride and theft laid bare before him. At length he said, "The panel will retire to consider whether the Crown is prepared to place belief where fraud has stood so recently." And with that, the commissioners rose and withdrew, leaving the whole chamber poised over the edge of decision. The commissioners were gone long enough for the room to begin breathing again in uneasy fragments. Someone coughed, a chair shifted, papers were gathered and regathered by hands that had no true business with them. Mallow remained standing, but the confidence had gone out of him. He looked like a man who had come to witness another person's undoing and found himself waiting instead upon judgment. Cordelia did not sit. Neither did Rowan. He had not tried to touch her after speaking. That, more than any display might have done, told her the depth of his seriousness. He had laid his heart before the room and then left her free. Whatever answer the commissioners gave, whatever the county said tomorrow or next year, he had not claimed her with performance. He had chosen exposure over strategy and truth over advantage. It was more than she had thought any man brave enough to do. At last the side door opened. The panel returned in solemn order, the chief commissioner holding the written determination in one hand. When he resumed his seat, the chamber stilled so completely that the faint hiss from the fire could be heard at the far wall. "This panel," he began, "has considered the objection, the admitted falsity of the original engagement understanding, the historical evidence produced concerning the hospital accounts, and the present declaration made before us." He paused. No one moved. "The old prohibition was framed to prevent collusion between hostile patrons. It was never intended to perpetuate a fraud created by theft. The evidence satisfies us that the original grievance between Hart and Marchmont rested upon deliberate false amendment and concealment by Ezekiel Crouch, assisted by later silence among interested parties." A stir ran through the room at that, but it was checked at once. "As to the present matter," he continued, "this panel does not commend deception, however charitable the motive. Yet candor offered before exposure is fully weaponized weighs more with us than fiction maintained to the end. The charter will therefore be renewed." Cordelia's breath left her in one quiet rush. But the commissioner had not finished. "The governance of Penfold Foundling Hospital is to be revised. No single-family claim shall again suffice to place the endowment at hazard. Upon the lawful marriage of Miss Hart and the Duke of Marchmont, the board shall be reconstituted to include the matron, one clerical trustee, and 2 independent governors drawn from the county. Mr. Hector Mallow's petition is dismissed." That last sentence landed like a door closing. Mrs. Vale bowed her head. Lady Agnes covered her eyes for one brief second and then lowered her hand as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Selwyn began to cry silently and looked furious about it. Mallow opened his mouth, thought better of whatever protest he meant to make, and sat down very slowly, all his polish turned suddenly dull. Cordelia looked at Rowan. He looked at her as a man looks at land after floodwater has begun at last to fall, not with triumph, but with grateful disbelief. The chamber broke then into movement, voices, signatures, clerks, sealed packets, and all the ordinary machinery by which great emotional upheavals are made official. Yet the real ending of the quarrel came later, when the two of them stood alone for one moment in the hospital chapel before going back into the world. The little painted door beneath St. Matthew's still hung slightly ajar. Rowan closed it gently with one finger, and the panel settled into place as if it had never opened at all. But the book in the saint's painted hands caught the light differently now. The secret had been hidden there for years, waiting for two stubborn people to stand in the same narrow space long enough to read it honestly. Cordelia slipped her hand into Rowan's. Outside in the cloister yard, the frost had begun to soften. Water dropped one bead at a time from the stone lip of the well, patient and clear. If this story stayed with you, you can leave a word below and subscribe for the next one when it arrives.